The scream of an infant shattered the pre-dawn silence of Julian, California, and Amelia Ashford pressed her trembling hands against her ears, trying to block out the sound that had become her constant companion for the past 6 nights. She paced the cramped room above the general store, bouncing her 3-month-old son against her shoulder until her arms ached, whispering prayers and pleas that fell on tiny, uncomprehending ears. The baby's face was red and scrunched, his little fists waving in the air as if fighting some invisible enemy, and nothing she did seemed to soothe him anymore. It was September of 1882, and the gold rush that had once made Julian prosper was now a fading memory, leaving behind a town of determined souls who scratched out livings from apple orchards and cattle ranching. Amelia had come here with her husband Thomas 18 months ago, full of hope and dreams of building a life together in this mountain town nestled in the Cuyamaca Mountains. Then Thomas had taken a job hauling or from one of the last operating mines and never came home, crushed in a cave-in that left her a widow at 22 with a baby on the way. The crying intensified, and Amelia felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she walked circles around the small room, her bare feet treading the same path on the worn wooden floorboards until she thought she might wear a groove into them. She had tried feeding him, changing him, singing to him, rocking him, everything the other women in town had suggested, but nothing worked for more than a few minutes before the wailing began again. The doctor had examined him twice and found nothing wrong, suggesting colic that would eventually pass, but Amelia was running out of strength to wait for eventually. She could hear the stirring of the family below, the Mitchells who owned the store and rented her this room out of pity more than profit. Soon Mrs. Mitchell would be knocking on her door with that tight smile that barely concealed her irritation, asking if everything was all right, if there was anything she could do, all while her eyes said what her mouth would not: make that baby stop crying or find somewhere else to live. Amelia sank into the rocking chair that had been Thomas's last gift to her, hand-carved by a craftsman in town, and held her son close, rocking frantically as if the motion alone could jar loose whatever troubled him. She was so tired that her vision blurred, so exhausted that she had nearly dropped him twice that night, catching herself only at the last moment. She had not slept more than an hour at a time in almost a week, and she could feel herself coming apart at the seams, unraveling like a poorly stitched garment. Through the window, she could see the first hint of dawn touching the eastern sky, painting it in shades of pink and gold that mocked her misery with their beauty. The town would be waking soon, and she would have to face another day of pitying looks and whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near. She had no family to turn to, no one who would take her in with a screaming infant, and her savings were dwindling faster than snow in the desert sun. The baby's cries rose to a new pitch, and Amelia heard herself making a sound that was half sob, half desperate laugh. She stood again, resuming her endless pacing, her nightgown sticking to her back with sweat despite the cool mountain air. She walked to the window and back to the door, from the door to the bed, from the bed to the washstand, over and over until the room spun around her and she had to steady herself against the wall. That was when she heard the knock, firm but not harsh, and she froze. It was too early for Mrs. Mitchell, and she knew no one else who would call on her at this hour. She clutched her baby tighter, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, alone in this room with only a flimsy door between her and whoever stood on the other side. "Madam," a man's voice, deep and quiet, somehow cutting through the baby's screams. "I don't mean to intrude, but I've been standing in the street for the past hour listening to that little one cry, and I was wondering if maybe you could use some help." Amelia's first instinct was to tell him to go away, to leave her alone with her shame and exhaustion, but something in the gentleness of his tone made her hesitate. She moved to the door, keeping the chain latched, and opened it just enough to peer through the gap. The man standing in the hallway was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as he met her eyes, and she saw no threat in his face, only genuine concern. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the kind of face that had seen hard living but had not yet grown hard itself. "I'm Jackson Norris," he said, his voice still pitched low as if afraid to startle her. "I work the cattle ranch just north of town. I've been sleeping in the stable behind the store while I'm in town settling accounts, and I heard your baby crying. I've got experience with colicky infants, if you'll permit me to help." Amelia stared at him, her tired mind struggling to process this unexpected offer. No decent woman invited a strange man into her room, especially not in her nightclothes with her hair hanging loose down her back. But she could see Mrs. Mitchell's door opening at the end of the hall, could see the woman's disapproving face peering out, and she realized she was running out of options. "Why would you want to help?" she asked, having to raise her voice over the baby's wails. Jackson glanced down at his hat, then back at her, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes that might have been old pain. "I had a sister once," he said. "She died of fever when she was just a baby, but before that, she cried something fierce. My mother was beside herself until a traveling woman showed us some tricks. I still remember them, and I thought maybe they might help you." There was honesty in his face that Amelia could not deny, and she was so desperate that she would have accepted help from the devil himself if it meant her son would stop crying. She glanced at Mrs. Mitchell, who was now fully in the hallway, arms crossed over her ample bosom, then back at Jackson. "All right," she said, unlatching the chain and opening the door wider. "But I warn you, nothing has worked so far." Jackson stepped into the room, and Amelia was suddenly conscious of how small the space was, how improper this situation appeared. But he moved with a careful respect, keeping his eyes averted from her state of undress, focusing entirely on the screaming infant in her arms. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hands. Amelia hesitated only a moment before passing her son over, watching as Jackson took the baby with surprising confidence. He held the child against his chest, one large hand supporting the tiny head, and began to walk in slow, deliberate circles around the room. His movements were different from hers, less frantic, more rhythmic, and he made a low shushing sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "What's his name?" Jackson asked, not breaking his stride. "Samuel," Amelia said, wrapping her arms around herself. "After my father." Jackson nodded, adjusting his hold so that Samuel's head rested in the crook of his elbow, the baby's body lying along his forearm. He continued walking, his boots making soft thuds on the floorboards, and began to gently bounce his arm in time with his steps. The shushing sound never stopped, steady and low, like wind through grass. Amelia watched in amazement as Samuel's cries began to lessen, not stopping entirely but losing some of their desperate edge. Jackson kept walking, seemingly tireless, his attention entirely focused on the baby in his arms. He moved from circles to a figure-8 pattern, then back to circles, all while maintaining that gentle bounce and soothing sound. "The motion reminds them of being in the womb," Jackson said quietly, not looking at her. "And the sound is like the heartbeat they heard before they were born. Sometimes it takes a while to work, but it usually does eventually." Amelia sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly aware of just how exhausted she was. She watched Jackson walk his circles, watched how he adjusted his hold when Samuel squirmed, how he never seemed to tire or grow frustrated. The baby's cries were definitely quieter now, interspersed with hiccuping breaths, and Amelia felt a flicker of hope that she had not allowed herself in days. Time passed in a strange blur. The sun rose higher, painting the room in golden light, and still Jackson walked. Amelia heard the sounds of the store opening below, heard the voices of early customers, heard Mrs. Mitchell's heavy tread on the stairs, but none of it seemed real. All that mattered was the man walking circles in her room and the baby whose cries were gradually fading to whimpers. "He's fighting it," Jackson observed, his voice still soft. But he's getting tired. That's good. Amelia wanted to ask how long he could keep this up, wanted to tell him he did not have to do this for a stranger, but the words stuck in her throat. She simply watched, mesmerized by the patience he displayed, by the gentleness in the way he handled her son. Another hour passed, and Samuel's eyes began to droop. Jackson continued his circles, never breaking rhythm, and when the baby's eyes finally closed and stayed closed, he kept walking for another 10 minutes to be sure. Only then did he slow his pace, gradually coming to a stop near Amelia. "Where should I lay him?" Jackson whispered. Amelia stood on shaking legs and moved to the small cradle beside her bed, pulling back the blanket. Jackson bent and placed Samuel in the cradle with the care of someone handling precious glass, tucking the blanket around him with gentle hands. The baby stirred but did not wake, his tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. Amelia stared at her sleeping son, hardly daring to believe it. Tears spilled down her cheeks again, but these were different from the ones she had shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a gratitude so profound that she did not have words for it. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Jackson. "I do not know how to thank you enough." Jackson straightened, rolling his shoulders as if working out the stiffness, and she realized he must be exhausted. He had been walking for over 2 hours without complaint, and now he picked up his hat from where he had set it on her washstand and gave her a small smile. "No thanks needed, madam," he said. "Just glad I could help. You should try to sleep while he does." Amelia nodded, suddenly aware again of her improper attire and the intimacy of having this man in her room. But Jackson was already moving toward the door, his hand on the knob, and she found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Will you be staying in town long?" Jackson paused, glancing back at her. "Few more days at least. Got some business to finish up." "If he cries again tonight," Amelia said, her voice barely audible, "would you, that is, could you?" "Just knock on the stable door," Jackson said, understanding what she could not quite ask. "I'm a light sleeper." He left then, closing the door softly behind him, and Amelia stood alone in the sudden quiet of her room. She looked at Samuel, still sleeping peacefully, then at the door through which Jackson had disappeared. She should feel ashamed, should worry about what people would say if they knew she had allowed a strange man into her room. But all she felt was an overwhelming relief and a curiosity about the cowboy who had walked circles for hours to help a woman he did not know. Amelia lay down on her bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes, and fell into the deepest sleep she had experienced in a week. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky and Samuel was stirring in his cradle. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding with the fear that the crying would start again. But when she lifted him, he simply looked at her with wide eyes and made the soft cooing sounds of a content baby. She fed him, changed him, and marveled at the difference in his demeanor. Whatever Jackson had done had worked some kind of miracle, and Samuel seemed like a different child. The rest of the day passed in a haze of normalcy that felt almost foreign after so many days of chaos. Samuel fussed a bit in the afternoon but was easily soothed with rocking and feeding. Amelia took him for a short walk through town, feeling the warmth of the September sun on her face and realizing how long it had been since she had ventured outside. People greeted her with less pity in their eyes, and she held her head a little higher. As evening approached, however, she felt her anxiety returning. What if Samuel started crying again tonight? What if Jackson's trick had only worked once? She prepared for bed early, feeding Samuel and settling him in his cradle, but she found herself listening for any sound from the stable behind the store, wondering if Jackson was there. Samuel woke around midnight, and Amelia braced herself for the screaming to begin. But when she picked him up, he only cried for a few minutes before settling against her shoulder. She rocked him, humming softly, and he drifted back to sleep without the desperate wailing that had characterized the previous nights. She laid him back in his cradle with a sense of wonder and gratitude that made her chest ache. The next morning, she dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple cotton print in pale blue, and arranged her auburn hair in a neat bun. She settled Samuel in the sling she used to carry him and made her way down to the store, where Mrs. Mitchell was arranging canned goods on a shelf. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," the older woman said, her tone decidedly warmer than it had been in recent days. "The baby seems much improved." "Yes, thank you," Amelia replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I apologize for the disturbance of the past week." Mrs. Mitchell waved a hand dismissively. "Babies cry. It's what they do. I'm just glad whatever was troubling him seems to have passed." Amelia wanted to tell her about Jackson, about his kindness and patience, but something held her back. Instead, she purchased a few supplies and asked casually, "Is there still a man staying in your stable? I thought I heard someone moving around back there yesterday." "Oh, that's Jackson Norris," Mrs. Mitchell said, warming to the topic immediately. "Fine young man, very respectful. He works for the Double N Ranch up north. Been coming to town for years to handle their accounts and supplies. Always stays in the stable rather than paying for a room at the hotel. Says he prefers it, and I don't mind as long as he keeps it clean, which he does." Amelia absorbed this information, filing away the details. "I see. Do you know how long he'll be staying?" Mrs. Mitchell gave her a sharp look, and Amelia felt her cheeks grow even hotter. "Few more days, I believe. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Amelia said quickly. "I just thought I should know who's staying on the property, for safety's sake." Mrs. Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Jackson Norris is as safe as they come, dear. You needn't worry about him." Amelia thanked her and made her way back upstairs, feeling foolish for her transparency. But as she settled Samuel down for a nap and found herself with a few quiet moments, she could not stop thinking about Jackson. She wanted to thank him properly, to do something to show her gratitude, but what could she offer a man who had asked for nothing in return? That evening, she made a stew with vegetables and beef, more than she could possibly eat herself. She told herself it was just good sense to make extra, that it would last her several days, but when she portioned it into a bowl and covered it with a cloth, she knew she was lying to herself. She waited until after sunset, when the store had closed and the street was quiet, then made her way down the back stairs to the stable with Samuel in his sling and the bowl of stew in her hands. The stable was a simple structure, housing the Mitchells' 2 horses and a wagon, with a small tack room that Jackson had apparently converted into temporary quarters. She could see lamplight glowing through the gaps in the walls, and she heard the soft sound of someone moving around inside. She knocked on the door frame, and the movement stopped. A moment later, Jackson appeared, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair damp as if he had just washed. He looked surprised to see her, and she suddenly felt very foolish standing there with her stew and her sleeping baby. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and she noticed he remembered her name, though she had not given it. "Is everything all right? Is Samuel crying again?" "No," she said quickly. "No, he's been much better. I just wanted to thank you properly, and I made too much stew, and I thought perhaps you might like some." Jackson's expression softened, and he stepped back to let her in. The tack room was neat and spare, with a bedroll laid out in one corner and his saddle and other gear arranged carefully along the walls. A small table held a lamp and a book, and she caught sight of the title, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. "You didn't have to do that," Jackson said, taking the bowl from her hands. "But I appreciate it. I was just going to have some hardtack and jerky." "It's the least I could do," Amelia said, looking down at Samuel's sleeping face. "You saved us, truly. I was at the end of my rope." Jackson set the bowl on the table and gestured for her to sit in the only chair, a rough wooden thing that looked handmade. He settled himself on a hay bale, picking up the bowl and taking a bite. His eyes closed in appreciation. "This is wonderful," he said. "Much better than hardtack." They fell into an easy conversation, and Amelia found herself relaxing in his presence. Jackson told her about the ranch where he worked, about the cattle and horses and the vast stretches of land that ran from the mountains down toward the desert. He spoke about the other cowboys who worked there, about the rancher's family, about the hard work and the satisfaction of it. In turn, Amelia found herself telling him about Thomas, about the dreams they had shared and the life cut short, about her fears and struggles as a widow trying to raise a child alone. "It's not easy," Jackson said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers with understanding. "But you're doing it. That takes courage." "I don't feel courageous," Amelia admitted. "Most days I just feel scared and tired." "That's what courage is," Jackson said. "Being scared and tired and doing it anyway." Amelia felt something shift in her chest, some tight knot of fear loosening just a little. She looked at Jackson in the lamplight, saw the kindness in his face, and realized she had not felt this comfortable with another person since Thomas died. It was a strange feeling, both welcome and frightening, and she was not quite sure what to do with it. Samuel stirred in his sling, making small noises, and Amelia stood to leave. "I should get him back upstairs before he wakes fully." Jackson stood as well, walking her to the door. "Thank you for the stew. And for the company." "Thank you for everything," Amelia said, meeting his eyes. "Truly." She returned to her room with a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the September evening, and when she laid Samuel in his cradle and prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about dark eyes and gentle hands and a voice that made her feel safe. The next day, Jackson appeared at her door mid-morning with a wooden toy horse, beautifully carved and sanded smooth. "For Samuel," he said a bit shyly. "I know he's too young for it now, but he'll grow into it." Amelia took the horse, running her fingers over the intricate carving, and felt tears prick her eyes. "You made this." "Whittling helps pass the time in the evenings," Jackson said, ducking his head. "I'm glad to give it to someone who'll appreciate it." Amelia invited him in, propriety forgotten in the face of his kindness, and they spent the morning talking while Samuel played on a blanket on the floor. Jackson told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his parents to illness and his sister to fever, about making his way west and finding work on ranches. His life had been hard, marked by loss and loneliness, but he spoke without bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of what had been. "Why did you never marry?" Amelia asked, then immediately regretted the forward question. But Jackson did not seem offended. He was quiet for a moment, watching Samuel grab at his own toes, then said, "Never found the right woman, I suppose, and the life of a ranch hand isn't much to offer. We move around a lot, live rough, don't make much money. Most women want more than that. Some women might care more about the man than what he has to offer," Amelia said softly. Jackson looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that made Amelia's breath catch. But before either of them could speak, Samuel began to fuss, and the moment passed. Over the next several days, Jackson became a regular presence in Amelia's life. He would stop by in the mornings before heading out to conduct his business, bringing fresh bread from the bakery or fruit from the orchards. In the evenings, Amelia would bring him dinner, and they would talk long into the night about everything and nothing. Samuel seemed to adore Jackson, reaching for him with chubby hands and gurgling happily when the cowboy picked him up. Amelia found herself thinking about Jackson constantly when he was not there, anticipating his visits, choosing her words carefully to make him smile. She had not felt this way since the early days with Thomas, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. It was too soon, she told herself. Thomas had only been gone a year. What would people say? But when Jackson looked at her with those warm, dark eyes, when he held Samuel with such gentle care, when he spoke to her as if her thoughts and feelings truly mattered, all her doubts faded away. She was falling in love with him, and from the way he looked at her, the way he found excuses to touch her hand or stand close to her, she thought perhaps he was falling in love with her too. On Jackson's last evening in town, Amelia prepared a special dinner, using the last of her butter and sugar to make a pie with apples from the local orchards. She dressed in her blue dress again and arranged her hair carefully, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. When she carried the food down to the stable, Jackson met her at the door with a look that told her he knew this evening was different. They ate slowly, drawing out the meal, neither wanting to acknowledge that tomorrow he would leave and they did not know when he would return. Finally, when the food was gone and Samuel was sleeping peacefully in his sling, Jackson reached across the small table and took Amelia's hand. "I don't want to leave," he said quietly. "I've been trying to think of reasons to stay, but I've already been gone from the ranch longer than I should be." "I don't want you to leave either," Amelia whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "I'll come back," Jackson said firmly, "as soon as I can. In a month, maybe less. And when I do, I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Amelia felt tears spill down her cheeks, but these were happy tears. "I would like that very much." Jackson stood, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. They stood close, closer than was proper, and Amelia could feel the warmth of his body, could see the pulse beating in his throat. He lifted his free hand and gently brushed away her tears with his thumb. "I've been alone a long time," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd gotten used to it, thought that was just how my life would be. But then I heard Samuel crying and met you, and suddenly alone feels unbearable." "I know," Amelia said, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. "I feel the same way." Jackson bent his head, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Amelia rose on her toes to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Amelia felt as if something that had been broken inside her was finally beginning to heal. When they parted, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come back," he repeated. "I promise." "I'll be waiting," Amelia said. The next morning, Amelia stood on the street with Samuel in her arms and watched Jackson ride out of town on a sturdy bay horse. He turned in his saddle to wave, and she waved back, holding Samuel's little hand and making it wave too. Then he was gone, disappearing around the bend in the road, and Amelia returned to her room above the store with a heart that was both full and aching. The month that followed was the longest of Amelia's life. She went about her daily routines, caring for Samuel and helping in the store to earn her keep, but her thoughts were always on Jackson. She wondered what he was doing, whether he was thinking of her, whether he would truly come back as he had promised. Mrs. Mitchell noticed her distraction and asked about it one afternoon, and Amelia found herself confessing the whole story. To her surprise, Mrs. Mitchell did not look disapproving. Instead, the older woman smiled and patted her hand. "Jackson Norris is a good man," she said. "If he said he'll come back, he'll come back. And it's about time you had something to smile about, dear." Samuel grew and changed, his colic apparently gone for good, and Amelia spent hours playing with him and the wooden horse Jackson had carved. She told Samuel stories about the cowboy who had walked circles to make him sleep, who had been kind to his mother when she needed kindness most. Samuel would babble in response, and Amelia liked to imagine he understood. 5 weeks after Jackson left, Amelia was hanging laundry in the yard behind the store when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She turned, her heart leaping, and saw Jackson riding toward her on his bay horse. He looked dusty and tired from the road, but his face lit up when he saw her, and he swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. Amelia dropped the shirt she had been hanging and ran to him, propriety forgotten, and Jackson caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet. She laughed and cried at the same time, holding on to him as if afraid he might disappear, and when he set her down, he kissed her right there in the yard where anyone could see. "I came back," he said unnecessarily, grinning. "I see that," Amelia said, unable to stop smiling. "I have something to ask you," Jackson said, suddenly looking nervous. "Can we go somewhere private?" Amelia led him upstairs to her room, where Samuel was napping in his cradle. Jackson looked at the sleeping baby with such tenderness that Amelia's heart swelled. Then he turned to her and took both her hands in his. "I talked to the foreman at the ranch," he said. "Explained my situation. He said there's a small house on the property, nothing fancy, but it's solid and has 3 rooms. It's been sitting empty since the last family moved on, and he said if I wanted it, it was mine. I could bring a wife there if I had one." Amelia's breath caught. "Jackson, I know it's fast," he continued, speaking quickly as if afraid she might interrupt. "I know you barely know me, and I have no right to ask this. But I love you, Amelia. I love you and I love Samuel, and I want to build a life with you both. I'll work hard. I'll provide for you. I'll be a good father to Samuel and any other children we might have. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy, if you'll just give me the chance." Amelia was crying again, but she was also smiling so hard her face hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jackson, I'll marry you." Jackson whooped and picked her up again, spinning her around the small room, and Samuel woke with a startled cry. Jackson set Amelia down and went immediately to the cradle, lifting Samuel and holding him close. "Did you hear that, little man? Your mama said yes. I'm going to be your papa." Samuel grabbed Jackson's nose, and they all laughed through their tears, and Amelia thought her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of Julian, with Mrs. Mitchell and her husband as witnesses. Amelia wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Mitchell had helped her sew, and Jackson wore a new suit that he had purchased special for the occasion. Samuel, now 4 months old, dozed through most of the ceremony in Mrs. Mitchell's arms, waking only to babble happily when Jackson kissed his new bride. After the wedding, they loaded Amelia's few possessions into a wagon Jackson had borrowed and set out for the Double N Ranch. The journey took most of the day, winding through the mountains and then down into the rolling hills where the ranch sprawled across thousands of acres. Amelia sat beside Jackson on the wagon seat, Samuel in her lap, and marveled at the vast blue sky and the golden grass that stretched in every direction. The house Jackson had spoken of was indeed small, but it was more than Amelia had hoped for. It had a main room with a kitchen area and fireplace, a bedroom, and a smaller room perfect for Samuel. The walls were whitewashed, and the previous occupants had left behind sturdy furniture that just needed some cleaning and care. There was a well nearby, a small barn for keeping chickens and a milk cow, and a view of the mountains that took Amelia's breath away. "What do you think?" Jackson asked anxiously as Amelia explored the house with Samuel in her arms. "I think it's perfect," Amelia said honestly. "I think we're going to be very happy here." And they were. The first months of their marriage were an adjustment as they learned to live together, to navigate each other's habits and moods, but every challenge only brought them closer. Jackson proved to be exactly what he had promised: a devoted husband and a loving father to Samuel. He would come home from long days working cattle, dusty and exhausted, but he always had a smile for Amelia and time to play with Samuel. Amelia made the little house into a home, sewing curtains for the windows and planting a garden in the spring. She learned to cook over the fireplace and to preserve food for the winter. She befriended the other ranch wives, forming a community of women who helped each other through the challenges of frontier life. Samuel thrived, growing from an infant into a chubby, happy baby who called Jackson Papa and pulled himself up on furniture, trying to walk. On their first anniversary, Jackson presented Amelia with a gift, a rocking chair he had made himself, carved from oak and polished to a warm shine. "For our growing family," he said, placing a hand on Amelia's belly where their second child grew. Amelia had discovered she was pregnant 3 months earlier, and this time the experience was completely different from her pregnancy with Samuel. She was not alone, not frightened, not uncertain about the future. She had Jackson beside her, solid and supportive, and she faced the coming birth with confidence. Their daughter was born on a cool November evening, delivered by one of the ranch wives with Jackson pacing anxiously outside. When he was finally allowed in, he knelt beside the bed where Amelia lay exhausted but radiant, cradling their daughter. "Her name is Rose," Amelia said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Rose Norris." Jackson touched his daughter's tiny hand with one finger, his eyes suspiciously bright. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." Samuel, now 18 months old and toddling everywhere, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside Amelia's chair and pat Rose gently, saying "baby" with great pride. Jackson carved him a smaller horse to match his first one, and Samuel would play quietly while Amelia nursed Rose, making the horses gallop across the floor. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Jackson was promoted to foreman, a position that came with more responsibility but also more pay and security. They added onto the house, building another bedroom and a proper kitchen. Amelia planted fruit trees that grew tall and strong, and she kept chickens and a vegetable garden that provided much of their food. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about cattle and horses and the land. Rose was a sweet, gentle child who loved to help her mother in the kitchen and garden. 2 years after Rose, Amelia gave birth to twin boys, James and Joseph, who were handfuls from the day they were born but filled the house with laughter and chaos. Through it all, Amelia and Jackson's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, as all couples do, but they learned to communicate, to forgive, to choose each other every day. Jackson never forgot the night he first walked circles with a crying baby, and whenever one of their children was fussy, he would scoop them up and pace the house, humming the same tune he had hummed for Samuel all those years ago. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, Amelia and Jackson would sit together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Jackson would hold Amelia's hand, rubbing his thumb across her knuckles in a gesture that had become habit, and they would talk about their day, their dreams, their gratitude for the life they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Amelia asked one evening years into their marriage. "Giving up the freedom of ranch life to be tied down with a wife and children?" Jackson looked at her as if she had said something ridiculous. "Regret you? Regret our family? Not for a single moment. You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live, Amelia. You gave me a home." Amelia leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. Leather and sage and something uniquely Jackson. "You gave me the same," she said softly. "I was drowning, and you saved me. You saved both of us." "We saved each other," Jackson corrected, kissing the top of her head. "That's what love does." As the children grew older, Amelia would sometimes tell them the story of how she and Jackson met, about the night Samuel would not stop crying and a kind cowboy had walked circles for hours to help. The children loved the story, asking her to tell it again and again, and Samuel, even as he grew into a young man, would smile and say he was glad he had cried that night, since it brought Jackson into their lives. Jackson continued to carve, creating beautiful wooden toys and figurines that he gave to the children and sold at the markets in Julian. His workmanship became well known throughout the region, and people would commission special pieces for weddings and christenings. He taught Samuel and the twins to carve, passing on the skill that had once been just a way to pass time but had become a family tradition. Amelia's garden flourished, and she became known for her preserves and pies, which she traded with other ranch families and sold in town. She taught Rose everything she knew about cooking and sewing and managing a household, preparing her daughter for whatever life she chose. The Double N Ranch prospered under Jackson's management, and the owner offered him a partnership, making him part owner of the operation. It was more than Jackson had ever dreamed of, more than he had thought possible for an orphaned cowboy from Texas. He accepted with gratitude and humility, and worked even harder to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. When Samuel turned 18, he announced his intention to marry a girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith. Jackson and Amelia gave their blessing, and at the wedding, Amelia watched her son dance with his bride and remembered how small he had been, how desperate she had felt that night when she thought she could not go on. She caught Jackson's eye across the room, and he smiled at her. That same smile that had made her feel safe all those years ago. Rose grew into a talented seamstress and opened a dress shop in Julian, partnering with Mrs. Mitchell's daughter. She married at 20 to a schoolteacher, a kind man who loved books as much as she did. The twins, wild and rambunctious as boys, settled down as they matured and both chose to stay on the ranch, working alongside their father and learning the business. Years turned into decades, and Amelia and Jackson grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving more slowly, but their love remaining constant. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, and their little house was always full of family during holidays and celebrations. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party at the ranch, with music and dancing and more food than any one family should rightfully have. Amelia wore a new dress Rose had made for her, and Jackson wore his best suit, and they danced together under the stars while their family looked on with love and approval. 30 years, Amelia marveled, her head resting on Jackson's chest as they swayed to the music. "Can you believe it? Best 30 years of my life," Jackson said. "And I plan on 30 more." "At least," Amelia agreed, lifting her face for a kiss. They both knew they were lucky, that not every story had a happy ending, that life could be hard and unpredictable and cruel. But they had found each other in the darkness, had chosen each other despite the obstacles, and had built something beautiful and lasting. As they grew very old, they would sit together on their porch in the evenings, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and remember. They remembered that first night, when Jackson had walked circles with a crying baby. They remembered their first kiss, their wedding day, the births of their children. They remembered hardships overcome, joys celebrated, a lifetime lived together. "I would do it all again," Jackson said one evening, his hands still finding Amelia's even after all these years. Every moment, every challenge, every triumph, all of it exactly the same. "So would I," Amelia said, squeezing his hand. "Especially the part where a cowboy knocked on my door and offered to help with a crying baby." "Best decision I ever made," Jackson said. "Second best," Amelia corrected. "The best was coming back and asking me to marry you." Jackson chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "You're right, as always." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Amelia thought about the journey that had brought them here. She had been so young when she first came to Julian, so full of dreams and hopes. Those dreams had died with Thomas, and she had thought she would never dream again. But then a cowboy with kind eyes had walked circles for hours with her son, had seen her exhaustion and desperation and had chosen to help, and everything had changed. She had learned that love could come when you least expected it, that happiness could be found even after loss, that families could be formed in the most unlikely ways. She had learned that strength came not from never needing help, but from accepting it when it was offered. She had learned that the best things in life often started with the smallest acts of kindness. As the years continued to pass, Jackson and Amelia remained devoted to each other and to the family they had created. They watched their grandchildren grow and marry and have children of their own, creating new branches on the family tree. The wooden toys Jackson carved were treasured heirlooms, passed down through generations, each one carrying the story of the cowboy who had once walked circles with a crying baby and found his family in the process. When Jackson was in his 70s, he began to teach his grandchildren to carve, just as he had taught his own children. He would sit on the porch with them, patient and gentle, showing them how to read the grain of the wood, how to use the knife safely, how to see the shape hidden inside the block. Amelia would bring them lemonade and cookies, and she would watch her husband with their grandchildren and feel such overwhelming love and gratitude that sometimes she had to turn away to wipe her eyes. "You were meant to be a father," she told him one evening after the grandchildren had gone home. "You're so good at it." "I had a good teacher," Jackson said, pulling her close. "You showed me what love looks like, what a family should be. Everything I know about being a parent, I learned from watching you with our children." "We learned together," Amelia said. "We built this together." As they moved into their late 70s, both Jackson and Amelia began to slow down more noticeably. Jackson's hands, once so strong and steady, began to tremble with arthritis, making carving difficult. Amelia's eyesight dimmed, and her once tireless energy faded. But they adapted, helping each other, leaning on each other as they always had. Samuel, now the foreman of the ranch himself, moved his parents into the main ranch house where they could be better cared for. But Jackson insisted on keeping his workshop attached to their old house. He would still go there on sunny afternoons, moving slowly but determinedly, and work on small projects. Amelia would sit with him, knitting or just watching, content to be in his presence. "Do you remember?" Jackson said one afternoon, his voice soft with memory. "That first night, when Samuel wouldn't stop crying and I knocked on your door?" "Every detail," Amelia said. "I was at the end of my rope. I had been crying almost as much as Samuel was. I was so tired I could barely stand." "You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Jackson said, smiling at the memory. "Even exhausted and desperate, you were beautiful. And when you handed me that baby, I knew my life was about to change." "Mine too," Amelia said. "I knew it even then, though I wouldn't admit it to myself. Something about the way you held him, the way you looked at me, I knew you were special." "I walked those circles for hours," Jackson continued. "And every step, I was thinking about you, about that baby, about how much I wanted to help, how much I wanted to take away your burden. I had been alone so long, and suddenly I wanted nothing more than to be part of something, part of a family. And you became the heart of our family," Amelia said, reaching over to take his hand. "Everything good in my life came from that night, from your kindness." "Our kindness," Jackson corrected. "You invited me in. You trusted me. You gave me a chance." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands, thinking about the life they had shared. Outside, they could hear their great-grandchildren playing, their voices high and happy, and both Jackson and Amelia smiled. "We did good," Jackson said finally. "Look at what we built. Look at this family, all these lives we touched. That's a legacy to be proud of." "We did very good," Amelia agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." As the seasons changed and the years continued their inevitable march, Jackson and Amelia remained together, facing whatever came with the same partnership that had sustained them through decades of marriage. When Jackson's health began to fail in earnest, when the doctor said there was nothing more to be done, Amelia moved her chair next to his bed and refused to leave his side. Their children and grandchildren came to say goodbye, filling the house with love and tears and memories. Jackson spoke to each of them, offering words of wisdom and love, making sure they knew how proud he was, how much he loved them all. But his eyes always found Amelia, always returned to her, and she knew that even in the end, they were still each other's anchor. On a quiet evening in late summer, with the windows open and a warm breeze blowing through the room, Jackson took his last breaths with Amelia's hand in his. She had been telling him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the good times, all the love they had shared, and she felt him squeeze her hand one last time before he was gone. The grief was profound, but Amelia did not regret a single moment. She had loved and been loved, had built a family and a life that mattered. She mourned Jackson deeply, missed him with an ache that never fully went away, but she also celebrated what they had shared. She lived for several more years after Jackson's death, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged with life despite her grief. She told stories about Jackson to anyone who would listen, making sure his memory stayed alive, that their love story was passed down to future generations. She kept the wooden horse he had carved for Samuel in a place of honor, and when children asked about it, she would smile and tell them about the night a cowboy walked circles for hours with a crying baby and changed everything. When Amelia finally joined Jackson, on a cold winter morning just after her 82nd birthday, she went peacefully in her sleep with a smile on her face, and those who found her said she looked as if she was dreaming of something wonderful. Perhaps she was dreaming of a young cowboy with kind eyes, walking circles in a small room above a general store, shushing a crying baby while his heart opened to love for the first time. The family buried Amelia next to Jackson in the small cemetery overlooking the ranch, and the whole community came to pay their respects. Samuel, now an old man himself, stood at his mother's grave and told the assembled crowd about the night his mother's life changed, about the cowboy who had helped when help was needed most, about the love that had grown from that single act of kindness. "My mother used to say that love finds you when you stop looking for it," Samuel said, his voice strong despite his years. "That it comes in unexpected ways, at unexpected times, through unexpected people. She and my father proved that every day of their lives together. They showed us all what real love looks like. Patient, kind, enduring, willing to walk circles for hours if that's what's needed." The story of Jackson and Amelia became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, passed down through generations. The wooden toys Jackson had carved became treasured heirlooms, symbols of the love and craftsmanship that had defined his life. The house where they had raised their children remained in the family, carefully maintained and lived in by descendants who honored their memory. And in Julian, California, in that small mountain town where it had all begun, people still remembered the widow with the crying baby and the cowboy who had helped her. The story became part of the town's history, a reminder that kindness and love could flourish even in the hardest circumstances, that families could be formed in the most unexpected ways, that sometimes the best things in life started with someone simply being willing to help. The wooden horse that Jackson had carved for Samuel so many years ago was eventually donated to the local historical society, where it sits in a glass case with a plaque telling the story of its creation. Children visiting the museum press their faces to the glass and ask their parents to read them the story of the cowboy and the crying baby, and parents obligingly tell the tale of love found in the most unexpected way. Years turned into decades, and decades into a century, but the story endured. The descendants of Jackson and Amelia spread across the country, but they always remembered their roots, always came back to Julian for reunions and celebrations. They told their children about the great-great-grandparents who had built the family through love and sacrifice and unwavering commitment to each other. In the end, what Jackson and Amelia left behind was not just property or possessions, but a legacy of love. They had shown their children and grandchildren and all who came after what was truly important: family, commitment, kindness, and the willingness to help others even when it was difficult or inconvenient. They had proved that love could bloom in the darkest moments, that happiness could be found after loss, that second chances were real and worth taking. The night that had started with a crying baby and an exhausted mother had transformed into a lifetime of love, a family that spanned generations, a story that would be told for years to come. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of a cowboy and his beloved wife walked circles together under the stars, their love as strong in death as it had been in life, eternal and unshakable, a testament to the power of kindness and the miracle of finding love when you need it most. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in the 21st century, still visited the ranch that Jackson had helped build, still ran their hands over the wooden toys he had carved, still marveled at the love story that had given them all life. They understood that their very existence was owed to a moment of compassion, to a cowboy who had heard a baby crying and decided to help, to a widow who had trusted a stranger with her most precious possession. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew through the Cuyamaca Mountains and the stars shone bright over Julian, California, it was easy to imagine a tall cowboy walking circles in a small room, a baby in his arms, whispering, "Sleep, I've got him," while a young mother watched with tears of relief streaming down her face, both of them unknowingly standing at the threshold of a love that would last not just a lifetime, but for generations to come, a love that would define a family and prove that the best things in life often come from the simplest acts of human kindness.